Well, welcome everybody to today's CFCI session and the first of our Climate Emergency Month series of discussions. This is the first of 3 Wednesday lunchtime sessions. So I think we haven't counted up how many of you have actually arrived, but certainly from the number of sign-ups, this is the biggest event so far of the CFCI online events and indicative of our collective need and desire for change. And not enough has changed since January of last year when Greta Thunberg said in her "House is on fire" speech, "I want you to panic, I want you to act as you would in a crisis." We hope this series of discussions will accelerate the process of change. Today's session focuses on what it is that we need to do. And next week we'll look at why it maybe isn't happening as fast as we'd like it to. And then we'll conclude on the third week with a series of talks from practitioners who are demonstrating what we must do and how they are doing it. And to local politicians will give us some context as to the local authorities' declarations of a climate emergency. Today we're fortunate in being joined by some really highly informed panelists. We have Joel Gustafsson of JG Engineers, who for many years worked alongside Hero Bennet, both then at Max Fordham. Hero is the principal sustainability consultant at Max Fordham. Max Fordham, as well as being committed to sustainable design principles since they began over 50 years ago, have been part of the UK Green Building Council's task force defining the principles of the zero carbon framework. We have Peter Clegg of Feilden Clegg Bragley Studios, best known in Cambridge, of course, for the Sterling Prize-winning Accordia housing project, but for whom sustainability has been a way of thinking for over 40 years, winning a Queen's Award for Sustainability in 2003 amongst a very long list of other awards. Peter is also here as one of the founding signatories of Architects Declare, a self-declared group of now over 1,000 practices who have pledged to take action to make a difference. And we're also joined by Sam Hunter-Jones, who's a lawyer working at Client Earth, who act to both inform and enforce policy related to climate change on behalf of the Earth and for those whose voices would otherwise be lost against governments or corporations. So we have these 4 relatively short presentations, leaving plenty of time to develop a discussion afterwards. So please put questions as you go, which I'll try and pick up in the chat. And using the model of any questions, I can put some of these questions on your behalf to the panel. So we're going to kick off with Joel, who's going to give us some background of what do we mean by zero carbon. So Joel, over to you.
Thank you, Meredith. Just want to check you can see the screen share.
Yep, that's good.
That's all fantastic. Okay, so thank you, Meredith. Yes, so I was wondering how to start this presentation, and I thought about using some of the shocking images of forest fires and floods and indeed droughts that sort of permeate the mainstream media. But actually, I find this image as a background here equally shocking. So this is why Greta Thunberg made her quite impassioned speech, and why we use this word emergency now in the title of our conference series. Each line represents a global average temperature between in this instance between 1970 and now. White is the average, and the redder it is, the warmer it is, and the more blue it is, the colder it is. So you can see the real ratchet. We're at the tipping point of a hockey stick, and ultimately, you know, we need to do something. Why are we talking about this now, right now? This has been known for decades. I mean, there were several decades in that red section there at the end. It's hard to say, I think. You know, what is certain is the mainstream media have started to pick up on more of the consequences in their reporting. Activism has certainly picked up. There's cause and effect there is hard to say. But one thing is certain, that the public appetite to understand and accept the need for action has increased, and in turn the politicians are responding to that with policy directions, but it maybe not necessarily direct action quickly enough, and we can come to that point at a later juncture. And so this is a framework that the Committee for Climate Change has put together that sets a potentially workable route from where we are to where we need to be legally by 2050. And that's at net zero for everything in the country. And the graph on the right here sets the premise for why we're here talking about this as our group of professionals, in that we are roughly about a third of the impact, perhaps slightly more depending on how you count it. And everything else is important, but the largest chunk is the operation of buildings in the UK. And the desire to change, and indeed the phrase zero carbon, net zero carbon, carbon neutral, has also been around for decades. It's not new, but unfortunately it has got a bit of a track record of being misused. It's got a track record of being potentially a little bit inaccurate, causing perverse decision making and outcomes. And so, as Meredith mentioned, the UK GBC put together a group of people, myself included, to try and gain a consensus on what a framework definition would look like. And the aims of this were for it to be credible, as in grounded and based in reality, but crucially, to be easy and readily understood, and crucially to encourage and indeed ideally enforce good decision making that reduces the environmental impact of buildings. And so I'm going to talk very quickly about the operational side, and Hero will address the embodied element shortly. So there have been a number of definitions in the past that have looked only at what a developer can control. So things like the efficiency of the heating system, or the amount of insulation, or the efficiency of lighting. And understandably, users faced with the tools they're given might not be able to get good performance. Likewise, developers would argue that they can't influence and impact how users use their buildings, both very credible arguments. So to cut through that, we have a definition here which is real. So there's no models involved, there are no assumptions at design stage, there's no fast forwarding for 25 years based on an assumption that today's situation will remain in perpetuity when we know anything but that is true. And so it's every bit of energy through the meter is carried and appraised. And then it's very simple. You have a carbon emission associated with your energy use, and you get a carbon benefit for addressing that from on-site renewables, and then indeed for most dense urban environments off-site and potentially offset. And it's not an annual thing that's audited and disclosed. So this seems all pretty easy, right? You're looking at this and thinking, that's fine. I'm just going to get some renewable electricity and run my building how I want. And these graphs would sort of argue in your favour. Here we have the carbon intensity of electricity in the UK decreasing. It's a remarkable success story, really, of decarbonisation over the last 10 years. And it's set to continue. The graphic there showing one of the reasons: very huge wind turbines off the coast of Merseyside, more coming in the North Sea, etc. And indeed the cables interconnection to low carbon electricity in areas which are sparsely populated with vast natural resources such as Norway. That cable is roughly halfway across the North Sea as we sit here. But there's a cautionary tale on that. So if we try and outsource this problem in its entirety and do what we do, we run out. So there's big demands on the renewable electricity, and indeed there are limits on how much we can generate. And it's very clear in the CCC reports, and indeed anyone that's appraised the capacity of the grid and generation capacity over the last 20 years, that buildings are actually, and the demand that they put on the grid, are the low-hanging fruit. We are easier than agriculture, transport even. And to put it bluntly, in order to address this emergency, we have to deliver our side of the bargain by reducing demand as well as decarbonising the supply. Thank you.
You're muted, Meredith.
That was an early one. Hero, if you could pick up the baton from Joel, that would be great.
Let me see if this is going to work. Is that working okay?
Yep, you're all good.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk a bit about the relative impact of buildings and going to introduce the embodied carbon verification requirements. So I thought I'd start by talking about what the definition of a net zero carbon building is. And of course, that really depends on your boundaries and scope. So buildings are responsible for a range of emissions, the fuels and electricity they use in operation. That's scope 1 and 2, as Joel discussed. But also the refrigerants that are leaked from cooling and heat pump systems. And these can be significant. So the 60-year impact of refrigerant leakage might be equivalent to 10 to 20% of the embodied carbon of the building over that 60 years. And of course, the location of the building and its design to facilitate low carbon travel or discourage car use can also influence the associated transport impacts. Those are the scope 3 emissions. And so for certain building types like museums with a large number of visitors, those dominate the building footprint emissions. And then of course there are the emissions caused by the building before it's even opened. So those are the construction or upfront emissions and the embodied emissions. So these are becoming a larger proportion of a building's whole life carbon emissions. But also kilo for kilo, they're more important because of course they're emitted today. So to reach our 2050 net zero goals, we need to halve our emissions by 2030. So operational emissions in 30 to 40 years time, they're just not going to have as much impact on stopping climate change. And what you can see in this graph is a study that we have done of different construction types, looking at that balance of operational and embodied carbon. And if you think about just in the 10 years that, those 10 years to 2030, then embodied carbon emissions dominate. But actually, when you look into the future over, say, 60 years, embodied carbon emissions still dominate because of this grid decarbonisation. So over the last 5 years or so, we've seen a real shift in the industry's desire to manage embodied carbon. So that's been through things like the Home Quality Mark and BREEAM, which are really kind of upping their game in terms of their methodologies for assessing these issues, but also really progressive policies from the Mayor of London in terms of requiring whole life carbon emissions to be reported at pre-app, at planning, and actually really interestingly at the end of the project, so project completion, to actually verify what has gone into the building, but also kind of voluntary schemes through the 2030 Climate Challenge and net zero carbon buildings. So we're getting much more clients kind of asking us for help on these issues. So in order to achieve net zero carbon construction, which is separate from net zero operational, but it's really important to understand that if a building wants to achieve net zero carbon operational, it does also have to achieve net zero carbon construction. So there's no maximum embodied carbon or any benchmark that you need to meet, but you must demonstrate that you've taken measures to reduce this and offset any remaining emissions at the point of completion. So you need to go through the process of checking what's gone into the building at the end, just like you would with an operational emissions report, and make that readily available and audited, just as with the operational. So I think I just wanted to highlight that like all aspects of carbon management, we need to be really careful to not mistake measurement for management. So simply measuring and reporting embodied carbon doesn't bring about a reduction. You need to use low carbon solutions right from the start, based on knowledge from previous studies, things that you already know, and then examine questions where you really don't know the answer yet. So most of the work happens in kind of stage 2 or 3, in terms of getting the form factor right, etc. But actually there is, you have to think about this all the way through the process. And then if you are going for that net zero carbon construction verification, you have to update your final embodied carbon model at the end of stage 6 with actual kind of data on what has gone into the building. So I thought I'd just end by pointing towards the new net zero carbon guide that Max Fordham have produced, and it gives an overview of many of the issues surrounding net zero carbon buildings, and hopefully will be of use. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Hero. Now over, if we could, to Peter Clegg. Are you able to screen share, Peter?
Yes, I think so. If I can, hold on, I'm just going to find. Sorry, can I just
Peter, currently we're seeing your Teams on the screen.
Are you not seeing this? Are you not seeing CFCI now?
No, you'd have to come out.
Stop sharing then.
Sharing. I think you maybe shared rather than a desktop. You probably.
I see. Sorry. Too many things open, I think.
You should be able to screen, if you go to share either screen 1 or screen 2, if you've got 2 different screens open, you should be able to share the screen, and that will have whatever, if your CFCI presentation is open on the screen, it should.
Yeah,
the whole thing.
It is now, so I'm just hoping that maybe I can now. No, it's not open on the screen. Damn it.
Well,
how about that? Is that any good?
We've got your PowerPoint.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay. Is that any good?
Yep, we're with you.
Put it on a full screen.
Well, if you
Sorry
can,
about
that would be good.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Sorry about that. Okay. Just to start by saying that I've been working on this about 40 years, working on low energy design for about 40 years, and as of a couple of years ago, I came to the conclusion that actually most of these buildings that you see here were failing in what we need to do as architects to meet the current objectives of zero carbon. We've had fantastic clients over the years. We've worked with the top engineers, mainly with Max Fordham's, I have to say, to produce some really interesting buildings, but they only touch the surface of the problems that we now need to face. And those problems became really evident, I think, in 2018-19. Firstly, the biodiversity report, UN biodiversity report, basically saying that we're in the middle of a sort of 6th extinction in terms of destroying the world's biodiversity. And of course, the IPCC global warming report saying basically we had sort of 10 years left to avoid 1.5 degrees of global warming. And as people have said, this amazing girl from Sweden and the extraordinary demonstrations that happened on the streets following on from all the Extinction Rebellion evidence and interest that they generated. And we sort of began to think that if you start looking at this data, we sort of began to look at what's happening in EU and US emissions, carbon emissions going down. But of course, all we're doing is exporting them to China here. So if you look at what we have to do, it now looks really dramatically serious. Made even worse by the fact, I think it was Joel was saying earlier on, that the buildings sector in the UK, this is looking at base data in 2018. We're doing very well in terms of our reduction of decarbonisation of our power in power supplies, and industry is not doing too badly, but buildings are doing really badly. And so, the challenges of all that is incredibly significant. And so a couple of years ago, with 17 founder members, Sterling Prize winners, we set up an Architects Declare website, put a simple declaration of principles out there, and we now have over 1,000 people signed up. I won't go into them in detail, but basically these are summaries of the declaration points, and key amongst them are obviously the raising awareness, keeping climate and biodiversity emergency front and at the front of everyone's thinking right from day one of any design process. Sharing knowledge and research and performance data on an open source basis, which is what Hero has touched upon, and a lot of those early schemes for the National Trust, Woodland Trust, etc. we did, excuse me, we monitored them very, very closely and carefully, but we haven't found other people doing the same data sharing. But more importantly, I suppose the recognition that, do we really need to build? Do we really need to put more carbon into construction, or can we upgrade our existing buildings? And accelerating the shift to low carbon, low embodied carbon materials is absolutely vitally important, as is more regenerative design, thinking about going beyond just sustainability. If we do sustainability, that's what we've been doing to date, and it is not just good enough. So the declaration has gone global. We now have 26 countries, 6,000 plus signatories. That means at least 60,000 people, I guess, behind those signatories, probably a lot more. We've also got regional declaring groups. There's one meeting in East Anglia next Tuesday, I think it is. Do check the AD website. And since then, obviously, it's been really gratifying to see RIBA coming out with these targets that have now taken hold. We're getting clients coming and talking about which targets we're moving to. And of course, we had the Letty guide, which is, I think, revolutionized things from a student's perspective, certainly, but also incredibly useful data for all architects, everybody working within the profession. From our perspective, we've started looking at the stage 1 and 2 that Hero was talking about. How you make that assessment? How do you go along to a pre-app in London with a whole life carbon assessment? So we've looked at developing this is FCBS carbon, looking at operational energy, life cycle embodied carbon, whole life carbon, and offsets if we need to. We've developed this bit of software which we trying to run through all our projects at very early stages, and trying to figure out exactly where we come in terms of the total energy demand, how that relates to this colored graph, which is the refers to the RIBA 2030 challenges, both in terms of operational energy and in terms of life cycle energy. This happens to be a project that's got a lot of timber in the superstructure, so we show it as an offset, and all of these are calculated carbon positive elements of the construction. Then looking at whole life carbon over 60, 90, 120 years, and offsets that might be necessary if we fail to meet those targets. And just to finish with, just to show you a snapshot of one scheme, happens to be in Cambridge, thought it might be good to show something local. Out on the Barton Road for King's College, a small scheme for 60 student and fellows rooms, looking at a CLT construction on the outside and clay on the inside and clay on the outside. So looking at that balance between sequestered carbon in the CLT and which is shown here below the line, and the problems we haven't yet solved in terms of foundations and concrete here above the line, facade, brick and the internal services, etc. But we are starting, we will, when this building is on site, we'll have a net 141 kilograms CO2 per square meter positive carbon benefit. And then we'll have, then we look here in much more detail at all the issues, all the materials that were going into the building. We look at all the operational side of it, and the we're beginning to actually look at well, this is all air source heat pump, and we're by adding PVs we can get it into the RABA 2030 challenge targets. And that's it, and that's it, and that's it. If it was supposed to be completed by Christmas of next year, it'll actually be completed in 2022. But actually, it is incredibly hard to meet anything like net zero carbon. So I mean, we're going all out here with a client who is really seriously behind it, with a Cambridge-based team of Fordhams and Smith and Walwork, and it's going to be a real challenge. We're going to meet the 2030 challenge, but we're not going to be net zero carbon. We're going to be net zero carbon for maybe 60, 70 years, we think. We're beginning to get there, but it's a challenge. It's a tough challenge. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Peter. That is going to set up, I'm sure, some questions for later. So to conclude the presentations, Sam Hunter-Jones is going to give us a legal perspective on things before we open up for questions.
Thanks, Meredith. Hello, everyone. So following on from those introductions to some of the technical aspects and challenges, I'm going to zoom out for a bit with some bigger picture scene setting and building on some of the excellent context that Peter and Joel have already set out. And I'll also give you a quick overview of some of our work in the area of local planning, which I think may be of some relevance to the construction and net zero carbon debate. So looking at the bigger picture, amidst all the uncertainty caused by the global pandemic, there have been some really big developments at the international level recently. China has now committed to carbon neutrality before 2060. The US seems set to rejoin the Paris Agreement and to set a net zero target for 2050. Otherwise, the EU, Canada, Japan, and South Korea have also all announced 2050 net zero targets. And that takes us overall to about 120 or so countries responsible for around 2/3 of global emissions, having either currently been considering net zero targets or having already adopted them. And it's not just the national level. You've also got local governments and cities and businesses setting these kinds of targets, from BP and Barclays to New South Wales, Australia's largest state by population. And all that's really welcome. But of course, the detail of those commitments will need close scrutiny. And some analysis that's hot off the press from Climate Analytics suggests that countries' Paris Agreement pledges and recent net zero proposals may reduce projected temperatures in 2100 by around 1.4 degrees. So down to roughly 2.1 degrees. So that's, if those proposals are delivered on, that's a really huge deal in terms of reduced climate impacts. It's still short of the Paris Agreement's 1.5 degree goal, of course, and missing that goal by around 0.5 degree will still lead to some really catastrophic impacts for many people and ecosystems across the world. But the momentum that behind those targets is really encouraging. However, it's really important to emphasize that the picture changes when you look at the nearer term. So for all those net zero commitments, there's a real lack of interim targets of the same ambition. So countries' current nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement, which run up to 2030, are clearly inadequate, with emissions, global emissions under those targets being roughly double what they need to be to stay on track for 1.5 degrees. And in the UK, we've increased our 2050 target, of course, to net zero. But on current policy, we're set to exceed our coming fourth and fifth carbon budgets. Recent 10-point plan. And of course, those budgets were set under the previous 80% target. So that's, there's a real, there's going to be a real step change coming soon. And the Committee on Climate Change are set to deliver their recommendation for the UK's sixth carbon budget next Wednesday, 9th of December. And that's the first one set under the net zero target. So it's an important one to watch. And that's likely going to really highlight the real gulf between current policy and where we need to be in the UK to go on to a realistic net zero path. I mean, for context, the fifth carbon budget required around 57% reduction in emissions below 1990 levels. So the sixth budget is going to really have to increase that level of reduction significantly to get us on track to 100% reduction by 2050. In its most recent progress report over the summer, the Committee on Climate Change made a number of recommendations that touch on the construction industry and buildings. So they looked at things like the Future Home Standard and the need to make sure that that is really defined in a comprehensive and robust way and put into legislation well ahead of 2025. And even, if possible, to bring the introduction of that standard in before then as well. And there's also the long-awaited buildings and heat strategy, which is going to have to make low carbon heating really the dominant form of heating installation by the early 2030s. So it's there's a lot of work to be done there, as well as on insulation, which we're currently really far behind on. And as others have touched on, embodied emissions in buildings is something that really national policy needs to grapple with as well. And I think also it's worth considering that transport emissions are also something that buildings have a role to play on. So the committee in the report recently stressed the need to ensure that new housing has good access to key local services and public transport, of course, to be able to encourage active and sustainable travel. And I think that's often something that's overlooked at the national policy level. So I think, and as others have mentioned, it's worth recording that buildings and transport emissions in the UK have more or less stayed flat or even slightly increased over the past decade. So we're starting from something of a standing start, and we need to really see some rapid action over the short term if we're going to have any chance of making the long term shift that we need to do. So that's a bit of a snapshot of the international and UK picture. And if we sort of turn quickly to what we've been doing at Client Earth, one related area that we've been working on is looking at improving compliance with local authorities' legal obligations in the context of local plan policy. And the two key bits of legislation and policy are Section 19(1)A of the 2004 Planning Act and paragraph 148 of the National Planning Policy Framework. Section 19(1)A requires that development plan documents must, taken as a whole, include policies designed to secure that development and use of land in the local planning authority's area contribute to the mitigation of climate change. And para 148 of the NPPF says that plans should take a proactive approach to mitigating climate change in line with the objectives and provisions of the Climate Change Act 2008. Now, essentially, these and other similar provisions mean that local plans should have emissions reductions objectives integrated across all aspects of planning policy. And the policies need to be justified by reference to their expected contribution to those wider national or even international objectives in terms of emission reductions. And I think planning is important because given the long lifespan of new development, to meet those legal duties, you need to show how the policies will, as far as possible, enable patterns and types of development consistent with zero carbon, a zero carbon economy. And I think that's something that that needs to be appreciated. And since we started working in this area, since we wrote to a number of local authorities in September last year, we've seen from a fairly low baseline some good pockets of best practice emerging. But I think it's fair to say there's still a long way to go overall, with many local authorities really appearing only to pay lip service to the need to take action on emissions in local plan policy. And just to finish, I think there's obviously a big question mark over how the government is going to seek to change the legal and policy framework following its recent planning for the future consultation. But in the meantime, we're continuing to push for compliance with the existing requirements. The sooner we can get local areas thinking about future-proofing their built environment, clearly that's going to be helpful to sort of get things moving in the right direction. So that's all I was going to say as an introduction. Thanks very much.
So that's terrific. So it's 25 to, so we've got 25 minutes of discussion left. So we've got some questions coming through on both the Q&A and the chat channels, which we can pick up on. Sam, I wonder if I could ask you a quick clarification question first of all, in terms of, you referred to the obligation that local authorities have to conform under the PPF to the provisions within the Climate Change Act. Exactly what levers that local authorities are able to use on a short-term basis, going back to the emergency that we're in order to impose something on development that's planned. Does it have to be as a part of the long process of putting a local plan in place, which, as we know, can take 5 or 7 years in some cases around here, or can it be done in a different, quicker way?
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. That's a good question. I think sometimes there is scope for using things like supplementary planning documents that can be consulted on and adopted in relatively short, over the short term. But really, I think, yeah, the key thing to get right often is going to be the local policy framework. That's really what dictates what standards are applied and the approach taken to choosing sites. And so, yeah, I mean, as long a process as that is, that's generally going to be the main avenue for trying to tackle this issue. There may be also
I think we've
local plan.
One of the questions that a number of people have brought up is about the existing housing stock and the difficulty, the massive task of transforming existing buildings to consume less energy. So I wonder if any of you could pick up that as a challenge, both in terms of the practical, technical challenge of being able to retrofit at scale, and perhaps whether there's any levers or mechanisms for local authorities or central government to bring that into the frame.
I'm happy to start off, Meredith. No, not a problem. I mean, I think we all have seen the challenges, both the Green Deal and which failed because it ultimately wasn't attractive enough, and the more recent Green Homes grant, which is stuttering because of a skills gap. So I think yeah, the technical challenges are there, but actually they're not as difficult as you might believe. You know, there are other European countries with successfully deployed schemes and incentive schemes that are operating, including grant schemes that exceed 100%. And I think the as big a challenge are the societal and regulatory mechanisms that sort of encourage and indeed potentially enforce. So two thoughts I've had, you know, in terms of landlords. So I actually have the dwelling stock housing statistics in front of me now, which is one of the advantages of conferences running this way. It's about sort of 40% of houses are private rented or social affordable rent. So actually, you know, landlords can be forced to improve, and the EPCC target that was enforced a few years back, clearly not ambitious enough, but that mechanism is in place. owner-occupiers, far more difficult, of course. There's a hassle factor, general willingness to engage in things that are disruptive and costly to your home. So something that is very financially encouraging or enforced at the point of sale. So where the disruption is already there would, I think, increase the take-up of domestic retrofit. But certainly, I mean, I would look, we've all got examples, and I think in week 3 we'll hear of some very good examples of successfully developed and delivered retrofit schemes. The technical elements can be resolved, in my view.
Peter, you're on mute at the moment.
Just to add to that, I mean, it might be worth, for those who are interested, just looking at what the Welsh Assembly's done, because I think they have a kind of coherent plan for looking at retrofitting the whole of their housing stock up until 2050, with the first 10 years being the state sector and housing associations, using that to develop the skill set that we no longer have, that Joel was talking about, and then allowing that to kind of work within the private sector. They put very large sums of money aside about a year ago to kickstart this project. I'm not quite sure whether it's actually happening yet, but it was, as a paper study, it was incredibly good.
Yeah.
I was going to follow up. Is that all right? So I think, I mean, just to echo kind of what Peter and Joel have said, I think it needs to be kind of a top-down approach as much as anything. You need that kind of long-term plan, and I think we haven't been seeing that. But yeah, just like Joel said, there are examples from other countries where those longer-term plans are demonstrating success. So I think there is also a skills gap for the small builders, and I don't feel like that's really being addressed anywhere at the moment. So you know, often homeowners are only going to meet you know, one professional who is their builder, and going some way to address this, I think would be really helpful as well.
There's actually there's a question that's come in, I think is quite interesting. How early, this is from Paul Kirkwood, how early do you think a contractor should get involved in the design of a building to ensure it achieves net zero carbon? And so I think, you know, understanding the intrinsic nature that a lot of the moves that are needed to be made in order to achieve a zero carbon building, Peter finished his presentation by saying it's really, really difficult. To what extent is it necessary to involve contractors or those really thinking about how the building is going to be built at the time that the building's being designed? Peter, maybe you could lead on that.
Well, I would just say it depends on the skill set of both the consultant and the contractor, doesn't it? We tend to learn from each other, and we learn from contractors who have considerable knowledge of particular areas that we don't understand as well. We have upskilled ourselves as an individual practice in terms of the use of CLT over the last 3 or 4 years, with the help of the manufacturers, subcontractors, and engineers that we work with. There are, I mean, I would love to talk to contractors about how to reduce waste in the construction industry. It's an area I don't know anything about, but I know that we are really bad at it. We, as an organization that are responsible for buildings, and I'm sure there are contractors out there who do understand those issues a lot better than I do. There are subcontractors as well. I was talking to someone from, I think it was Rockwool the other day, saying, well, we'll come and collect any waste Rockwool that you can show us anywhere. The circularity of materials is a really important thing that we can learn from, where we can learn from the industry. But it depends on the skill sets that contractors and others have to offer. And some of them have, that varies hugely, let's put it like that.
Can I just extend that then? There's another question that's come in on a similar nature. To think about building services engineers, we have 2 on the panel who there's often a difficulty in the disjunction at you know, delivery and design. The question here is coming about, are we not thinking about procurement of buildings in the right way? Would there be a different method of procurement that would make it more possible to have a zero carbon that's designed and delivered?
Do you want me to lead?
Sure.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I think, look, there's a performance gap. So, you know, the gap between design and idealistic performance, or indeed calculated performance, and how buildings actually work. And procurement is possibly one of those issues, but I think it can be realistically made to work regardless, with enough communication, okay, and enough buy-in, and potentially enough contractual weight behind the actual the performance at the end. Because for all of the best will in the world, the modeled performance during the design stage is that it's a model. The one thing that's certain is it's wrong. It's just a question of how wrong. Buildings will be used differently to how you predict them. Schools may stay open, you know, 4 hours, 5 hours longer for community use than you assume they do. For example, people might put twice as many or half as many occupants in a domestic dwelling, which changes the whole energy picture. So we need to be mindful of that. Buildings are flexible, organic entities. And so the real question is, how do we optimize buildings? And that actually ties into a few of the other threads here. And it comes back to the net zero carbon definition there. This is about firstly measuring. You'd be very surprised how few building owners and operators really know how much energy they use. But maybe you wouldn't. So knowing that, disclosing it, comparing it with other buildings, comparing it with best practice. And I think that we as professionals have a duty to demonstrate what best practice looks like. And that isn't just the eco-bling stuff that was there in the early noughties. It certainly isn't that, but it's communicating and disclosing real energy use and making that have an intrinsic value for other people to be able to follow. And I think, yes, there are certain procurement types which disjoint that process of a handover of an ideal to a delivered product to a working building, but communication within any procurement route, I think, can start to address that.
Thank you. Sam, a question for you. Like many of us who've been working in this field have been desperately frustrated with the slow change of legislation, which has failed to keep up with ambition and rhetoric. You mentioned the Committee on Climate Change are going to be given a report next week with their recommendations. What, from the perspective of a lawyer who's tasked with suggesting to people they follow the law and do what they should do, what are you hoping is going to come out from those recommendations that, from your perspective, would have the biggest impact?
Yes, I think the headline is going to be the recommendation around the actual budget itself. So looking for something that's going to be ambitious and actually is going to realistically put us in the right direction to get to net zero. Because obviously, you know, we need to be reducing as many emissions as we can in the short term, because a lot of the emissions that we need to eliminate in the final 5 or 10 years are going to be really hard to abate issues. They're going to be really technical and difficult. And so I think we need to be really focusing on these which others have mentioned already. You know, there's a lot of around retrofitting existing stock, you know, things like that really we should be doing now and you know, and getting on with, irrespective of what targets really. But I think one thing I'm hoping for, in terms of the associated accompanying report from the committee, is I think they've suggested they're going to be looking at what local areas and local authorities can be doing in terms of climate mitigation, and sort of mapping out the different policy levers they have and trying to consolidate some of the best practice. And I think that's going to be very helpful. I think the committee's advice and recommendations are a really helpful benchmark generally, but also particularly for lawyers who are looking to hold government to account.
Thank you. I mean, we're all really hoping it's going to be very clear guidance. It seems what the industry has always been asking for is clarity. You know, it seems that more than anything, they want to know what they have to deal with so they can deal with it. It's not saying, they're not saying that they can't do it, Peter's saying it's really, really hard. They're saying, tell us what we need to do so we can plan for it. So yeah, we have all been distressed by endlessly promises being lost. So let's hope for next week. Peter, you had a point on that.
Well, I'm just going to following on from what Sam said. I do think that with regard to the upgrading existing buildings, I mean, if you look at Boris's 10-point list the other day, it was all adding technology. It's not changing houses and adding insulation. It's all down to heat pumps and photovoltaics again. Stuff that you can add in, and it's not changing the fundamentals of producing much better quality housing stock, which is we just have signally failed to do.
A question for Hero. There's actually a few questions that have come on a kind of technical and risk issues. One of them is about switch from gas to hydrogen, which is being talked about a lot. How, in terms of translating the gas-led heating system to a hydrogen one, is that likely to work? To come into play fairly soon? And if so, how? And what do people do about it? What do contractors and building owners need to be thinking about?
I think I'll probably defer this to Joel, but I mean, I will say that there certainly are clients who are interested in it, but it's expensive. It's very high risk. The regulation isn't really there to support it. There are significant technical challenges. Do you want to pick up, Joel?
I'm going to go a little bit further, and I'm going to say no, it doesn't have a future, certainly in the short term, and probably not in the medium or even long term, for delivery of heating to buildings. There's a number of reasons. I mean, it's technically without merit. If we just talk about efficiency in the first instance, so taking 1 unit of green electricity and delivering that as heat to a building via hydrogen is 46% efficient. You have losses in the electrolysis, you have losses in the storage and losses in the transport. Conversely, if you take green electricity and turn it into heat, which is ultimately the goal for buildings, using a heat pump, including the losses in the grid, etc., about 270% efficient. So you've got roughly, a factor of four or five there on the efficiency level. So that's put that to one side, which actually translates to 4 or 5 times more wind turbines or solar farms or nuclear power stations or HVDC cables. So that's the expense. Secondly, there's a number of challenges on the delivery here. I mean, what we're suggesting is a top-down changeover of combusting methane in a national grid to hydrogen. So that has a number of technical challenges to do with the equipment and the combustibility and the explosiveness of hydrogen and the change of the equipment. It isn't a simple retrofit. Anything that's missed is potentially very dangerous and puts life at risk. But also the kind of very practical technical level. When gas was changed, which is often the equivalent that's given from town gas to natural gas, it was a quick change. Most of the stuff stayed the same. There was a top-down government-owned grid. We don't have that anymore. Here we do need to make changes, right? So the pipes in people's houses will likely need to get bigger. So if you have a change like that, who takes responsibility for removing any paneling and changing those pipes and making good the decoration? Who pays for all that stuff? And all these challenges are very real. And actually, when compared to a technology which is the de facto go-to heat solution for vast swathes of the world, which is heat pumps, right? Heat pumps, whether they're VRF air conditioners in the subtropics that provide a little bit of heating when it's cold but are predominantly cooling, or whether they're Scandinavian air-to-water heat pumps, or indeed the French market's exactly the same. They're proven. Millions and millions and millions are installed per year, but not in the UK. So I think this is an unwelcome distraction to this agenda. And in addressing climate emergency on this timescale, both now in the next 10 years, but very likely in the next 30, we do need to stop talking about hydrogen in this context.
Well, that was a clear rebuttal. So that was a question from Stafford Critchlow. So you can take that off your list of things to worry about, Stafford. There's been a number of questions that have come in about measurement tools and monitoring, and also about consistency, about an industry standard. So obviously this is going to become clearer, but because there's quite a proliferation of things out there that and lots of individual practices like FCB have been developing things on their own because of this sort of absence. Is there a sense about what the industry in general should be looking towards to use as a method of engaging with embodied carbon and zero carbon measurement?
I might jump in there. So I think, I mean, this is a real issue, actually. We've definitely, you know, I think that there's people have kind of filled a gap because they've seen the need. You know, they just need something now. I think that the industry is getting there. So you know, all the conversations that are being had through LETI, through UKGBC, through REBA, which is you know, all the organisations are talking to each other, so that's fantastic. But there is still, and they're really trying to do the same thing and agree the same thing, but there is still some confusion, I think, at the moment. So, I mean, one of the biggest issues is not necessarily the kind of the tool, you know, on embodied carbon alone. It's not necessarily the tool you use. It's the scopes that you choose to include. So whether you're going sort of, you know, full A to C, just, you know, all the way to D, or what you're including, and the assumptions you're making in terms of the environmental product declarations, grid decarbonisation, etc. There's any number of, you know, sequestering carbon. There's any number of assumptions which can massively change the results, you know, by a factor of 10 or so. So this is a real problem, and we are starting to see some standardization, and I think more will come. But it's, I mean, the conclusion we're coming to at Max Fordham is that is how to manage that uncertainty. The longer you look into the future, the more the uncertainty becomes a problem. So, you know, we're focusing very much on the upfront carbon emissions, the bit where you've got the most certainty, and we're hoping that more EPDs will come through from manufacturers. I think on the operational side, there is a bit of a tension at the moment between, really, if you're trying to be really progressive, then passive house planning package is a really useful tool for kind of really drilling down into all emissions and really kind of pushing the boundaries. But that is in conflict with, you know, you have to use SAP for compliance, or you know, if you're doing BREEAM, then there's a conflict as well. So I think, yeah, there are some issues there. I think organisations are probably talking to each other a bit less on that side around the operational, I'd say.
So the upside probably is that the industry consultants and are all being used by the government in order to make something that is driven by the industry rather than delivered down to us. So that's the upside, I suppose. The downside is that it seems that until it becomes law, then nothing happens on a big scale. And that's what we're all really kind of waiting on, you know, what is the mechanism by which everyone is going to need to comply? And we're nearly out of time. One very quick answer and then another question. If anyone can throw in, which other countries have retrofit policies that work? Question from Anne Miller.
I'm happy to take one. I went to see a non-domestic, privately delivered development of a historic building in Belgium as part of a conference about 3 years ago, where the developer was given a 100% capital grant for the insulation itself and the labour to put it in, and also a small tax rebate. So effectively paying the developer to insulate the building.
So that's a government mechanism. I mean, NFID, the obvious standard that a European standard of measurement for retrofit buildings. Last question then, which is from Simon Devlin about how do we approach our local authority and put pressure on councils to give more weight to dramatically improving our impact on CO2 emissions. So question for Sam.
Thanks. Yeah, well, I mean, we're involved with following up on our letters to the local authorities by participating in consultations and local planning examinations, and that's something that we're continuing to work on. But yeah, I mean, otherwise, I think it's the usual routes of engaging with councillors and through campaigns and consultation responses. Really, I think, yeah, and I think the key is to keep on doing that, irrespective of the uncertainty that there might exist about the future framework that the government's consulting on, because it's really unclear, to what extent those proposals are going to survive the consultation and be passed into law or to new policy next year. So I think just one of keeping scrutiny and keeping pressure on with the existing standards and requirements.
We all know that actually not many people give responses, so it would be meaningful if you do give one. And the Cambridge City Council has a consultation out at the moment with responses by, I think it's the 20th of December, on their climate change policy. So do look at that and write into the City Council and telling them what you think of what they've set out. Well, that's pretty much us out of time. So thank you all for attending. Do stop by next Wednesday for the next session. And I'd just like, on behalf of all of you attending, to thank our panelists for giving their time today. Thank you, folks, and have a good afternoon.